All right, welcome back. So my goal for this meeting, for this video, is to make it shorter than the other ones. We'll see how that works, but I'm going to probably cut it short halfway through. Um, and it's also getting a little late where I am currently. You might be probably watching this at a different time, but bear with me. Um, we're going to now not turn much at all, really, but we're going to turn slightly um, and talk about motivated reasoning in politics. The connection, the link between these two things is probably one of the most important things to know if you want to understand why people believe the things that they do. Um, Motivated reasoning itself is a process by which you can definitely start to kind of figure or understand um, the different wacky kind of political beliefs that people have today, and sometimes it can help us understand why people have what we might consider kind of more normal political beliefs, if that exists anymore. It probably doesn't, but uh, you should know that information processing is highly motivational. Okay. Not only can it be broken down into heuristics and deliberation and stuff like that, but at the core of it, there are motivations involved. And confidence is just one of those, as I discussed in my video on information processing. Uh, but we'll see exactly what it means, or what I mean, or what who talks about motivated reasoning means by um, the motivational underpinnings of information processing. We'll see what that means in a bit here, but let's start by going through the steps of information processing, because the actual information processing part that we discussed in the information processing video only really happens at this step, the third step. Okay. Um, Steps 1, 2, and 4 are also going to be really critical when it comes to determining what people believe, and zooming out a little bit more, or maybe zooming in depending on your perspective, how social media influences people's politics. Um, or any kind of media, it doesn't need to be specifically social media, podcasts, news articles, any kind of media, any kind of information that people see or encounter, right? Um, all of these steps, obviously including step 3, matter. So we're gonna break these down even more to help us figure out what is going on in this, again, wacky world that we're living in. And that's to put it nicely. So at the start, our starting point before we take any steps is motivation. Okay, this is at the root of all of our problems. What do we mean? Uh, what do specifically political psychologists or psychologists in general mean by motivations? Okay, so as you can see, these are short and long-term goals. Motivations are short and long-term goals that influence our behavior and thinking. Okay, that's a little circular, but we'll get into a bit more detail. Um, and these motivations emerge from both conscious and unconscious sources. So, like, we might know that we have a certain motivation. We might know that we have a certain goal. Um, we might know that we have a short-term goal, a long-term goal, but sometimes we might not be aware of our motivations at all. Um, we might be aware of the source of our motivations, but we might not be aware that these motivations are influencing the way we think. Um, and that's why they're really important. That's part of the reason why they're really important. So, what are some of the sources of motivations? Okay. Um, this is pretty much the root of the root, right? The everything that happens before the race. Um, if you think that the information processing is a race for some reason, right? The start is the motivation, but even before then, when you're at home, carbo loading or whatever people do before races, I have no idea. I don't do that. Um, they have to come from somewhere, okay? And I'm just providing you with a list of different sources for these motivations, right? Sometimes, in other words, the sources of the goals that we have, the long-term, short-term goals that we have, especially when it comes to how we process information. Okay, it's not necessarily about going out and running a race, right? But how we process information. Okay. So one of those sources of motivations is the strength of our prior opinions or beliefs. A lot of the times we refer to these as just priors for short. Another really big source of people's motivations when it comes to information processing are psychological predispositions. For example, some people can be generally open-minded. They could also be, generally speaking, closed-minded. Um, this is going to have an influence on our motivation or motivations, plural. Another source of our motivations when it comes to information processing is our self-concept. Like what that means is the person we want to be. Do we want to be an accurate person? Do we care about being an accurate person? Are we more concerned about maybe expressing how loyal we are to our groups? Are we more concerned about flexing how knowledgeable we are, regardless of how accurate that knowledge is? All of these things relate to our self-concept, which will then influence our motivations. Because if we take these examples, right, if you have a self-concept that you're this loyal group member, right? You might identify strongly with a certain sporting team, right? You're a fan of the Celtics, like I am. Go Celtics! 2024 NBA champions, baby. You might be, you might, this is how you perceive yourself. It's your self concept. So now this concept is going to influence how motivated I am to then um, process information that is either going to um, strengthen my ability to defend this group, to uplift this group, um, or it could influence my motivation to, if we're going outside of the realm of information processing, having the self concept of of a sports fan could influence my motivation to go out and go see a game, or to buy a bunch of you know jerseys or other kinds of memorabilia. um, so again, this is kind of like an underlying psychological construct that then goes ahead to influence what my short and long-term goals or motivations actually are. Like I note here, these don't necessarily need to be real, uh, true characterizations of who we are as individuals. Oftentimes, they're just our perceptions of who we are. So if we just perceive ourselves to be accurate people, that could be enough to motivate us to um, process information to reach, the conclusion that this piece of information is actually accurate when it's credible, um, and well sourced, well cited, or whatever uh, heuristics you might use to determine whether something is credible enough to believe. All right. Um, Another source of motivations are just transient feelings, like, for example, anger. Your anger might motivate you to go out and find information that paints your enemies in a bad light. Um, Anger, and we'll talk about emotions probably in the later half of this video, but maybe in other weeks as well. Um, Anger is an approachive emotion, meaning that uh, it exists to kind of make you want to go out and accomplish something, maybe punish someone. Um, so it's a highly motivational emotion. In other words, it creates at the very least, it's strongly associated with motivations, goals to go out and um, unleash your anger in a way that you know for in any way, maybe some bad ways, maybe some more positive ways, but in ways that reduces your anger because you don't want to feel angry. Ultimately, this is something that can have a strong influence on your motivations. Okay. um, so these are all um, going to lead to motivations, not that they are motivations in themselves, um, but they lead to motivations. Um, you could kind of define them as motivations in themselves as well, but you don't. It gets the line's a little blurry. Okay, um, and again, in this for our purposes, it's going to be really helpful to talk about the motivations to believe or disbelieve something, right? We're talking about information processing and arriving at a certain conclusion as to whether or not something is true or not, all right, which is at the crux of this social media bonanza, for lack of a better word. So here's a little bit more. Let's get a little bit into the weeds of information processing by an example, because sometimes our motivations um, conveniently can work in the same direction. Um, they're all pointing to the same thing and allow us to easily arrive at a preferred conclusion. There's nothing holding us back. We believe with full confidence that something is true or something is false. Every goal within us, every motivation within us is saying yes. We did what we wanted to do, and we have concluded, boom, this is legit information. Okay, so here's an example. Say you have a hypothetical person, say they have liberal policy preferences, and I should say this hypothetical person does definitely, I'm not going to lie, does definitely describe a lot of people out there. But you might even know somebody that's like this. I know I do. So this person might have liberal policy preferences. They want to remain loyal to the Democratic Party establishment. And they're not really particularly concerned about Biden's cognitive decline. They don't think they're just not worried that it's going to pose any substantial risk to his presidential campaign. So they end up just defending Biden and saying, we should, put all of our support, throw all of our support behind him and not really consider anybody else. Just keep marching in line in lockstep with him. So that is what happens if you notice that all of these motivations nicely point to the same conclusion, which is, support the Democratic presidential candidate. If you're liberal, you're probably almost certainly going to be motivated to support the Democratic presidential candidate. If you want to remain loyal to the party establishment, the Democratic Party establishment, well, voting for and supporting the Democratic presidential candidate turns out very consistent with that motivation, wanting to remain loyal to it. Not worried about Joe Biden's cognitive decline. Well, that's good, because if you were, you might be hesitant to support Joe Biden as opposed to somebody else. So all of these different kinds of motivations, all again lead to the same conclusion, to defend Joe Biden. And this is actually an example of behavioral outcome of motivated reasoning, or motivations and information processing, I should say. We haven't really gotten to motivated reasoning yet. Um, but you can just kind of extend this to information processing, where we look at a piece of information and conclude at the end of the day. Let's say you watched the debate, and that's just brand new information to you. You might not have been aware of Biden's cognitive decline. So that new information then kind of has to go through all your motivations to then reach a certain conclusion. And for this hypothetical person, uh, that pretty cleanly led to them still supporting Joe Biden. That is their political preference at the end of the day. Okay, that's the conclusion that they drew about the state of the world, is that Joe Biden should continue to be the Democratic candidate for president, or the candidate for president for the Democratic Party. Okay, so the thing is, oftentimes, and probably most of the time, our motivations can conflict with each other. So sometimes the motivation that matters most to us is going to determine where we fall when the dice is cast, or the die is cast, I think is how the saying goes. So let's think of another hypothetical person, and this also describes a lot of people out there. They have liberal policy preferences. They want to remain loyal to the Democratic Party, but they happen to be extremely concerned that the cognitive decline actually threatens Joe Biden's 2024 electoral chances. So the question for them is, what do they do? Do they still defend and support Biden? Or do they start coming to the conclusion that maybe a better candidate should be chosen through whatever process is available? So this is, again, a situation that a lot of people are finding themselves. And what might end up determining how they conclude, or like what preference they end up holding, is whether or not their motivation to ensure that some kind of liberal policy preference is actually enacted, or, and maybe these two motivations are probably might be the most in conflict here, remaining loyal to the Democratic Party establishment. If that motivation is going to outweigh their desire for liberal policy preferences to be implemented. If they want to remain loyal to the Democratic Party establishment, they might end up supporting Joe Biden. But if they are worried, if they are, as they, as this hypothetical person is, concerned about Joe Biden's chances of winning, and they also prefer liberal policies, then, it all really comes down to which motivation is stronger within them. And that, again, if we go back to the sources of our motivations, those things can be highly influential in determining which one wins out. So if your self-concept is this loyal person, you might end up just going full on Joe Biden 2024. If a source of your motivations are instead like fear or anxiety, then you might be more likely to prefer somebody else taking his place. Now, this is not a guaranteed path from emotions or loyalty to those two conclusions. They can go either way depending on a bunch of different factors. But at the end of the day, people are faced with a conflict in their motivations, and oftentimes the strongest motivation wins out. Okay. Okay. So those are our motivations. They're really complicated. We have a lot of them. They could lead to uh, different conclusions, even if we have very similar motivations across different people. Across, if let's say, put it another way, let's say you have a group of people, they all have very similar motivations, maybe the same motivations, right? But if just one motivation matters more to them, if the source of their motivations is more influential, you could have that whole room of people with the same exact motivations believing different things because there are just so many different factors at play that come somewhat before motivations. Okay, but that's motivations at the start of our journey on information processing. Now let's take a step forward. And again, we're coming, like I mentioned in an earlier video, we all are nice little special snowflakes with our own individual differences, encountering information as unique people. Sometimes the same information, sometimes different information. But one of those differences is our motivations, right? And we're encountering information. So I think it's helpful to categorize information into three groups for our purposes, right? You could obviously break this down in a different way. So the first way is old information, the first kind of information, old information. And that's in relative terms, not in absolute terms. So you might read a news article from 1976 about some news event that happened there. I'm not sure what happened in 76, can't remember right now. But if you already knew about that historical event, then that's not new information relative to you. I'm sorry, that's not old information relative to you. It's old in absolute terms because it's from the 70s, but in this case, we're talking about old information relative to the person that's encountering it. They've never seen it before. Okay, that's distinct from novel information, which is new to the person. They've never encountered this kind of information before. Okay, then there's, okay, ignore that. There's the third kind of information, which is old information presented in a novel way. This happens a lot. Okay, it's going to be a little bit beyond our scope right now, so I'm only going to focus on 1 and 2. But we can maybe discuss the effects of 3 as well. Old information presented in a novel way. I'm sure there's more kinds of information. In fact, I'm certain there are. But for motivated reasoning and for kind of the theme of this week, this is going to be these two categories, old and new information, are really going to be important. So let's talk about what happens when people encounter old information. So if it's old information, they've already seen it before, it's nothing new, it's more likely to reinforce both the opinions that they have and their factual beliefs. All right. So what is the difference between opinions and factual beliefs? So a lot of people use the word belief and opinion interchangeably. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's fine. But we can get a little bit more specific, okay? Because by opinion, we are mostly talking about preferences over specific policies or for general ideologies, general preferences over how government should run, or society should run, right? So for example, a preference or an opinion would be should whether or not billionaires should be taxed at the same real rate as their secretaries, as opposed to their effective tax rates, which are definitely lower. Or I guess effective and real tax rates are the same. I should say the same effective tax rate as their secretaries, as opposed to their nominal tax rates, which are oftentimes higher than their secretaries, but they're not really paying that. And a lot of people find that unfair. or another kind of example of an opinion or preference is, should cognitive tests, whether or not cognitive tests should be required for US presidents, um, at the very least, whether or not they should be released to the public. Um, the thing is, these are totally subjective preferences, and they're based on predictions of the future, usually. Um, by factual beliefs, on the other hand, we mean whether or not you believe something to be true or not. Maybe something in between true and false. Um, and these are claims of these are objective claims of reality. Um, Factual beliefs are. So, for example, did Donald Trump attempt to call in the National Guard during January 6th? Something that came up in the June 2024 presidential debate. Another example is, did Joe Biden resume building the wall along the Mexican border? Something that Donald Trump got famous for and got a lot of, you know, a lot of heat for doing so, especially among immigration activists and people that just don't like Trump. Um, well, if you said yes to one or no to two, you'd have a factual belief. You would have a factual belief, but it's objectively wrong. Okay, so you are making an objective assessment of reality that is your factual belief, but it can be wrong. All right, so that's really the difference. That's another difference, at least, between objective reality and sorry, of factual beliefs and opinions or preferences. Opinions and preferences, although they can be entirely misguided, um, don't really need to reflect reality as much. So here's just two headlines from AP News reinforcing the idea that, counter to what Trump said during the debate and counter to what many people might think if they haven't been paying attention to the news. Yes, Joe Biden has initiated more building along the building of a wall. He's, build the wall Biden at this point, along the Mexican-Texas border. And no, Donald Trump did not sign an order to deploy National Guard troops during the January 6th riots in the U.S. Capitol, despite the claims that he did. So yeah, these are things that, again, not depending on your perspective, you might believe to be true or not true, but reality is reality. Okay, so as I said, if you encounter old information, um, I should say old information that's old to you. Again, just to reiterate, we're specifically talking about information that you have already seen. Okay, this reinforces oftentimes your prior beliefs, and that can be adaptive. All right, this seeing information that just reinforces what you already believed, whether it be a factual belief or a preference, doesn't already always need to be bad. So I'll give you a political example, a politician who tells their constituents that they cut the deficit. I gave this example in a previous video, but the news actually consistently reports that there's been a constant increase in the deficit, and you've seen that news over and over and over and over again. You're less likely to see this politician just say random BS, because just based on the fact that you've seen one kind of information over and over and over again. Okay, so that's good. I mean, even if obviously the downside is that the news could have been lying and the politician could have been telling the truth. And if we lived in that world, it'd be very bad. But given how our heuristics work, and luckily that we haven't collapsed into a full dystopian reality, at least not entirely, the news is probably, if it's a credible source, probably going to be more accurate than some random politician who's trying to make claims that, they're better than they actually are. Okay, here's a non-political example that might be a little more concrete, I guess. So, you know, the reason why old information can help us um, uh, survive or thrive or whatever, live our lives, is, in a relationship, and many people in their lives are bound to encounter or have to deal with a relationship like this. Um, in a relationship with somebody who's, say, narcissistic, who insists on denying patterns of their behavior, well, because old information has the effect on human beings of reinforcing our prior beliefs and making it harder for new information to change those beliefs. We're not going to let, some person who's just like, oh yeah, I know I've been doing these bad things to you, um, but trust me, I'm not. I'm not doing that, and you're crazy. Um, Luckily, we have, most of us have an evolutionarily developed kind of accountability mechanism that prevents somebody from stepping in and kind of just gaslighting us that easily. But that's not to say that, anybody's flawed for being successfully gaslit. Oftentimes, uh, you're going to have people try to gaslight you by presenting that information more and more and more and more, so that it becomes the old information that is becoming reinforced and reinforced over time. And any new information um, of like an abusive relationship or any instance of an abusive relationship is now the quote unquote novel information that has to compete with this new sense of reality that you had been gaslit into believing. Okay. Now, this, funnily enough, is a kind of interpersonal example, but it can be extended to politics really easily, and we will probably discuss that. Okay, so as you can kind of guess, and as I've alluded to, suggested a little bit here, this tendency for old information, once it's repeated, to become reinforced in our minds, can be maladaptive and, kind of bad for our survival and our thriving. So an example of that is just uh, many different kinds of conspiracy theories that are out there that are like objectively false. Um, um, Again, when we because we live in the information era where we're inundated with information, just blasted, when we're doom scrolling, just information. Um, this leads to us, or many people at the very least, seeing objectively wrong information over and over and over again, and that creating a sense of reality that is just not true, creating a bunch of factual beliefs that are objectively wrong. But unfortunately, what it does when they see it over and over again is just it reinforces their priors, making any novel information that is incongruent or disproves that prior to be less and less likely to be accepted as truth. Although I don't want to be spreading misinformation here. Apparently, there are some some frogs that engage in same-sex behavior. I'm not sure if that's true, so I'm just going to throw that out there. That's not to say that that has anything to do with politics, or that the person who's most famous for saying that is a valid person. He's not. It's Alex Jones. If you're not familiar with that conspiracy theory, it's become a meme at this point. So just a little background on that. Okay, so um, and last thing here. This definitely went on a little bit longer than I expected, but my apologies. Um, this leads us to going back to information, the the dual process theory of information processing. Because what encountering old information over and over and over again does is essentially help us close our confidence gap. Okay, the more we see something, the more confident we're going to be that that thing is true. Um, there are some obviously exceptions to this. I'll say this, I've said this before, and I'll say it again. Not everybody's the same. Not everybody encounters the same information the same way. Some people are able to see BS on their social news feeds, social media feeds, and be able to tell right away that it's BS. But some other people aren't really equipped to do that. So, especially for those people, when they see a lot of these, say, conspiracy theories over and over and over again in maybe a filter bubble or an echo chamber or whatever, that starts to narrow the confidence gap. It makes them feel more confident, um, and it pushes this closer and closer and closer to that desired confidence, and people are then fully confident, they've that the information that they keep seeing is objectively true when it could be wrong. And that's a strategy that a lot of disinformation peddlers uh, are pursuing. They're fully aware that this is a process that happens. Okay, they know the research, and if you have interested parties out there that want people to believe certain things, they're just going to show people the same things over and over again, repeat their talking points over and over again. It happens on both sides of the aisle, and it doesn't necessarily need to be conspiracy theories. It could just have to be it could all it has to be is uh, a, a campaign, an information campaign trying to convince you to believe a certain thing, support a certain candidate, despite contravening evidence that they might not be the best candidate. So like I promised, I'm going to leave it there. Um, Halfway through on step one, we're going to, I'm going to follow this up with steps 2 and 3. And I think there's 4 in the next video. So I'll see you then.